Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, MPs and staff were pictured queuing up in the Houses of Parliament yesterday. But they weren't all waiting to sign David Cameron's leaving card. No, they were hoping to find out details of a plan to redraw the boundaries of parliamentary constituencies in England and Wales. It's all part of a government plan to equalise the number of people in each constituency and to cut the overall number of MPs. Constituency boundaries are reviewed periodically to ensure every MP represents roughly the same number of people. Legislation passed in 2011 means that the number of MPs must be reduced from 650 to 600. With a few exceptions, like the Isle of Wight, every seat will now have to have around 74,000 voters. The Independent Boundary Commissions, one for each part of the UK, decides how the map is redrawn. Their draft plans will see 32 fewer constituencies in England, 11 fewer in Wales. Northern Ireland is already due to lose one. Scotland is expected to lose 6 constituencies. But redrawing the political map is always controversial. According to one estimate, if the 2015 votes had been cast under the proposed boundaries, Labour would lose around 25 seats across England and Wales. And the changes could see the seats of some high-profile MPs broken up and divided between neighbouring constituencies. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, former Chancellor George Osborne and Brexit Secretary David Davis could all join MPs in a scramble to secure a new seat. They can argue their case in the consultation that's now underway, with the final proposals due in September 2018. The government says this is a matter of fairness. Here's the Cabinet Office Minister Chris Skidmore speaking earlier.
The boundary review is being introduced because it was voted on by the previous Parliament, and it enacts for the first time the historic principle of having equal-sized constituencies. It was a principle first called for by the Chartists in 1833. It's been called for by the Standards and Committee on Public Life. As I said, it was legislated before by the previous Parliament. The government's determined that every seat should be equal. Currently, we have seats which are 3 times the size of another, which means that one elector's vote is worth 3 times that of another. That's simply not fair, which is why we're determined to ensure that we have equal-sized constituencies, which is why this review has been enacted.
Chris Skidmore there. Well, we're joined now by Sam Hartley. He's Secretary to the Boundary Commission for England. Welcome to the programme. It's clearly a complex process, so how do you actually go about doing it?
It is a very complex process, and we don't hide or shirk from that fact. I mean, today we launch our initial proposals, and it's the first time that the public can get to see what the new map of parliamentary constituencies might look like. So, as you've outlined, we've got to reduce the number of constituencies across the UK as a whole, and I'm from the English Commission, so we've got to reduce from 533 to 501, and we have to make much more equal the number of electors in each constituency, and we do that with the help of the public. So we look at the electorate data and we look at the existing constituencies, and we conduct 3 rounds of consultation. Today is the first day of the first round of consultation. We want people to go and look at the proposals on our website and tell us what they think of them. Right.
Do you think you'll get a big response?
I'm very confident we'll get a big response. I mean,
okay.
We've really tried to make this as open, transparent and engaging as possible. Looking back at previous reviews, at the last review the Boundary Commission conducted, we got over 50,000 public comments on our proposals. So we know that this means a lot to people. We've made it easier than ever to comment on our website, and if I can just give you the address, which is bce2018.org.uk, and it's very easy to look at the proposals, see how they affect you, and send in your evidence to us about whether we got them right or wrong.
Oh, you'll get thousands more now you've said that on air.
I hope so.
I mean, you said you don't take politics into account in this process. That sounds nigh to impossible when you are redrawing constituencies. I mean, many people, not least Labour politicians, who stand to lose most from these changes, argue that this is unfair and undemocratic.
Look, it's our job to make independent recommendations to Parliament, and that's what we will do. And as I stressed at the top, I mean, we really rely on public comments for this process. We want people to tell us about their communities, to tell us whether the boundaries we've proposed really reflect them or not. bearing in mind the tough constraints that we have on us about the reduction and the equalisation. But we try to take the politics out of it, and we leave that to the politicians.
Right. Why haven't you based it, though, on the most recent poll, the EU referendum, where 2 million people signed up to take part in that? They won't be part of this.
Well, the technical answer, I'm afraid, is that it's in the law. So the law tells us to take account of the December 2015 electoral register. It would be wrong of us to do anything other than that.
Right. Why does the law do that? I mean, what's the justification? If there are 2 million more people who could be part of this, it sounds to me unfair not to include them.
Look, that's really a question for Parliament or the government to take. What I would say, of course, is that the existing elections on the current constituency boundaries are based on electorate from the year 2000. So this is already a significant improvement on the current state of affairs. But as I said, the question about when the snapshot is, the figures that we base on, is one for Parliament to take and the government to take, and not for the boundary commissions.
Right, so you sort of accept that it is out of date, even though obviously much more up to date than from 2000.
Well, look, I accept that there has to be a point in time where we take a baseline bit of data. That for this review is December 2015, and as I said, it would be wrong of us to take any other information into account.
So you say the public are going to have a big say in this. I mean,
Yes.
let's take one or two of the quirks in the proposal. Slough Town Hall, for instance, would no longer be in the Slough constituency, which may strike people in Slough as slightly odd. Is that the sort of thing that could change?
That's exactly the sort of thing that we can change, and that's the sort of evidence that we require. It's a tough job, as I said. I mean, we have, make no bones about it. It's difficult for us to get constituencies that reflect people on our first go, and we are very open to hearing what people say using that sort of evidence. And just to look back at the last review again, nearly 2/3 of our proposals, our initial proposals, changed before we got to revised proposal period. So we're very open to people's comments. We want people to use the website to do that.
All right, Sam Hartley, thank you very much. Well, as we said earlier, not everyone's happy about these plans, not least Labour, who are expected to be hardest hit by the changes, and we're joined now by the Shadow Minister without portfolio, Jonathan Ashworth. Do you accept, Jonathan, that parliamentary constituencies should roughly be about the same size?
Yes, of course I do.
Well, isn't that what this is about?
Well, it's not really, because this is about reducing the number of MPs from 650 down to 600. There is a strong suspicion that 50 MPs was taken out because that will hit the Labour Party most. Once you go beyond 50, you tend to bite further into Conservative MPs. But the other issue is, what you touched upon, is that there's 2 million people missing from this register.
But it's in the law.
And that is not fair. Well,
it's a fairly powerful argument to say it's in the law. Parliament could change it.
Well, it's in the law because the Conservative government, or the Conservative coalition government at the time, had the votes in Parliament to pass that piece of legislation.
Right.
But we always said that to use the register based on a different way of getting on the register. You may remember the arguments we had over something called individual voter registration, where getting on the register became a little bit more burdensome. We always said, don't go for the register in November, December, wait a little bit longer, as indeed the Electoral Commission, and we all advised the government to look at the register this year, and they've ignored that.
Right. Putting that just to one side, do you accept that Labour at the moment, under the current drawing of the boundaries, has an unfair advantage?
No. No, they don't. This is a Tory argument about how the vote is distributed across the country. It's because in a lot of safe Conservative seats, a lot of Tory votes pile up, where the Labour vote tends to be more evenly distributed across the country.
Right, you're skewing this whole process. I mean, it's clear, isn't it, that actually the Labour Party will be the biggest loser?
No, it's not a skewed process at all. It has to happen. As we've just heard, the figures that are currently being used are 16 years out of date. An awful lot has changed across the country in terms of house building and people moving and everything else. And it's not a political process. It needs to be done. And I think it's absolutely right to reduce the number of members of Parliament as well.
Why?
We've said, well, partly it's about saving money in terms of the cost of politics. We are the largest legislature in, I think, the Western world.
Why did you do something about the House of Lords?
Well, that's also, I think, on the government's agenda as well. That's been spoken about, and we obviously have the ability for peers to resign. We've got 50 fewer peers than we had before. But look, two wrongs don't make a right.
It's stuffed to the gills, isn't it, the House of Lords? And actually it's been stuffed even more by David Cameron in recent months. Surely the unelected House of Lords would be a better place to start.
I think you need to do both, actually, and I think that's what's going to happen. I do think it's right to have a fewer number of members of parliament, and it must be right that MPs are representing roughly the same number of people. We get the same resources, we've got the same demands. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn seemed to be saying this morning that if you were in an urban area, you should somehow represent fewer number of people. That doesn't work or stack up at all. And the Labour Party has always complained about this. You know, the 1970 general election was fought on 1953 electoral data. The Labour Party's got history on this. It's time that the register was updated and the boundaries were updated.
Well, I wasn't born in 1970, so I don't know. I was born in 1978. But the issue is, you know, there's 260 extra unelected peers in the House of Lords under this government, costing us something like 32 million a year. We're going to be losing our European members of Parliament. 73 MEPs are going to lose their jobs. So presumably, we as members of Parliament are going to have a greater legislative responsibility in the House of Commons. So why cut down to 600? Why not do it at 650 MPs, but equalise the constituencies on that basis?
Well, because it's something that Parliament have voted for, to cut the number of members of Parliament. We did it in the last Parliament. I think it's absolutely right. I say we are the largest legislature in, I think, the Western world. It doesn't make sense anymore. And I say, I think we should look at the number of peers as well. But look, peers have been created in the last few years from all parties. You know, this is, and as I say, we now have the thing where actually peers are able to retire when they reach a certain age, and 50 have taken advantage of that.
Why is it fair that a Labour seat has around 5,000 fewer people or voters in it, and therefore you have an unfair advantage in terms of being elected than Conservative seats that have around 71,000 voters, so far higher than the average Labour seat?
Well, my Labour seat has over about 73,000 voters in it.
But I'm saying broadly, and you accept that, don't you, that there are Labour seats that are elected, people are elected on far fewer votes?
Well, that is why we've said that the principle of equalising the constituencies is the correct approach. But what we have at the moment is a very tight numerical number that the Boundary Commission have to work to with very limited flexibility. I mean, there used to be more flexibility in the process, so you could make more allowance for local factors, like, you know, I was hearing on the radio this morning there's seats which have got like a mountain range running through them, have been suggested on these proposals and things like that, which are just impractical. But
that's why you have the ability, when we're all now looking at the proposals, members of the public are, we've now got time to send in revisions, to point out practical things that don't work. There'll be public hearings. You know, we've got another, 2 years before this is actually finally voted on and accepted.
Indeed, but when push comes to shove, you've got to hit 75,000 with 5% either way. I mean, that's a much tighter range than what was the previous
But if you've accepted the principle of equalisation, I mean, that's what it means, you know, having a number and then obviously a flexibility, a target.
You're keen to reduce the cost of politics, so why not reduce the number of ministers?
Well, that's something else that's going to be looked at. I mean, to be honest with you, I think...
Do you support that?
Well, I'm not sure, because, look, we're going to come on and talk about Brexit in a moment. I have to say, this is going to be a pretty busy government, doing more legislation, not leaving things to the EU. So, no, I don't think I would support that, having been a minister and seen how hard the ministers were.
No, I mean, but in a sense, although you've asked for the House of Lords to be looked at, it's not going to be looked at to all intents and purposes just at the moment, and there's no sign of the cost there being reduced. You don't want to reduce the number of ministers. You're really very keen on reducing the number of MPs. People may well conclude that it's because of party political reasons.
I think people will be wrong to conclude that. You know, everyone's always going to say, look, those who don't like the proposals will say it's party political. Those who do will say, actually, we're cutting across politics. It's got to be fairer to have equal-sized constituencies. The point is, this is overdue. It should have happened in the last Parliament, and it didn't. And therefore, we are now working on the basis of figures from 16 years ago. And I can see in my constituency, you know, there's been a massive amount of house building. There are people, it doesn't take account of people who have moved in. And it must be right to say we all get the same resources as members of Parliament. The amount of money we get to employ staff doesn't reflect the electorate that we have.
I think this part about ministers is actually very important, because the government are not saying they're going to reduce the size of the ministerial payroll.
People don't tend to when they're in power, though, do they?
No, indeed. So they're proportionately, they're going to be a bigger part of the chamber. So there's actually an issue about holding ministers to account. There'll be less backbenchers to hold the executive to account, and that cannot be fair.
Hang on a second, John. if you were serious as a Labour Party about holding ministers to account, you'd get yourself sorted, you'd get yourself a leader who actually doesn't create distractions, and you start being an effective opposition. You're not being, so you can't make that point seriously.
Right, and on that basis, aren't these boundary changes going to just trigger another almighty power struggle within the Labour Party? Because a number of your colleagues, let's take Tristram Hunt, Yvette Cooper, Rachel Reeves, people who've been critical of Jeremy Corbyn in the past, well, their seats could well be up for grabs, there could be fights, and they may well be reselected or deselected, and then a new candidate reselected.
No, there's no question. It's going to be a very uncertain time for some of parliamentary colleagues because their seats have disappeared. Same on the Tory party, by the way. 17 Tory MPs are going to lose their seats. That's the same size as Theresa May's majority, of course.
But they're
so
not
that's
in the
going to
midst,
be
they're not in the midst
interesting
of a civil war, are they, internally, for a battle for the heart of the party?
I mean, there's quite a lot of unhappiness amongst Tory MPs in the backbenches.
So you think your colleagues will be perfectly safe?
No. I think Labour MPs, if they're in a re-selection battle, are going to have to, convince members in an area that they're the right person to continue. Well, of course, Jeremy Corbyn's seat apparently is disappearing, and he's letting it be known that if these arrangements go ahead, that he'll be fighting the new, I think, Finsbury Park.
It is a totally new seat that will be fought. Well, what do you say to Darren Williams, who joined the NEC, Labour's national ruling executive, relatively recently, has said the process of choosing candidates to fight new or altered seats in the 2020 general election would provide an opportunity to select individuals who are in tune with the views of ordinary party members and Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I obviously sit on the Labour Party's national executive committee.
Just about.
With, just about. I've been there for 3 years. I'd have no intention of leaving it. But I sit on that national executive with Darren Williams, and I don't think Darren's comments will have found much favour amongst Jeremy. He's done Jeremy, I think, a bit of a disservice in making those comments this morning, and I think he shouldn't be embarrassing Jeremy in that way, because that is not what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do.
You don't think Jeremy Corbyn feels that actually, if he is re-elected as leader, that there should be MPs who are more in tune with him and party members in order for there to be unity?
Well, Jeremy has asked Rosie Winston to lead on our boundary change reselection processes. We have a standard procedure, which is the procedure we used in the last round of boundary changes, which was ahead of the 2010 general election, where MPs will be able to fight or put themselves forward for a seat if they've got a certain proportion of that seat in the new constituency. So, for example, as I understand it, Jeremy has got something like 50% going into the new Finsbury Park and Stoke Newington seat. He'll be able to put himself forward, and the members of that new seat will be able to decide whether they want Jeremy Corbyn as their Member of Parliament.
It would be an opportunity, though, wouldn't it, to deselect MPs that members don't like?
Well, any MP has to go for a reselection process. Whether you have a boundary changes or not, every Labour MP has to go for a reselection process. Our branches meet to decide whether we want us to carry on. We've always had that. I mean, thankfully, the good members of Leicester South reselected me in the last Parliament, and I'm rather hoping they do it again in this Parliament. That's not new. We've always had that in the Labour Party in the last 20 years.
And do you think they'll reselect people like Tristram Hunt and Yvette Cooper?
Well, I would hope so, because they're both excellent first-class members of Parliament, and I know they work hard for their constituencies, and I know that they're always taking up issues on behalf of their constituents, so I would hope that they get reselected, and I expect them to do so.
John Ashworth, thank you.
Now, with opinion polls suggesting Labour is 10% or so behind the Tories, Jeremy Corbyn faces an extra burden, with changes to the political map which could cut up to 25 Labour seats. The Independent Boundary Review's radical plans to redraw constituency boundaries have provoked a fierce political row over changes which could make it a lot harder for Labour to return to power, as our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
The Commons is one of the biggest parliamentary assemblies in the world, 650 MPs. Ministers want to cut it to 600 and make their seats much more equal, within 5% of around 75,000 voters. So inevitably, some MPs will lose their seats.
It's right that having made savings elsewhere, MPs should be able to put their own house in order. This measure is going to save £66 million over the course of a parliament. That's quite a lot of money. And so we need to cut the cost of politics, and we need to do so by cutting the number of MPs.
David Cameron won last year's election with enough new MPs to get a majority of just 12. The Tory government would be more secure, though, with these boundary changes, less prone to defeats by backbench rebels. Labour will be the party worst hit, expected to lose between 20 and 25 seats in all. The Conservatives, it's thought, will lose between 10 and 15. The SNP, 6, and the Liberal Democrats, 3. That would give the Tories a comfortable majority of around 38. 3 times as much as now. Labour leadership challenger Owen Smith is one of several figures whose seat has been radically redrawn. Like lots of Labour MPs and Tories, he may have to compete with neighbours in a kind of musical chairs. George Osborne's under threat in Cheshire and may have to fight the backbench leader Graham Brady. Current cabinet ministers with problems include David Davis on Humberside, Priti Patel in Essex and Alan Cairns in Vale of Glamorgan. Other Corbyn critics that could lose out are Chris Leslie in Nottingham, Ian Austin in Dudley and Tristram Hunt in Stoke, all facing contests against Labour colleagues. But Jeremy Corbyn's crying foul.
The figures the Boundary Commission is working on are December of last year. Since then, well over 2 million more people have joined the electoral register. We need a fair electoral system that guarantees equal representation of all constituencies. By using out-of-date figures, they can't do that.
Corbyn's own seat in Islington is redrawn a bit, which could mean him partly moving into Hackney and Labour neighbours in turn moving eastwards. But some local voters welcome a cut in the number of MPs.
It's probably a good idea if they're more equal, but again, it's how you slice the cake and who ends up where.
It's a lot of bums in seats and getting a nice bit of money for nothing.
Well, that's not good for democracy.
It's not good?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
Less representation. I think the more MPs, the better.
But talk of the new boundaries helping the left to deselect Labour MPs is probably overblown. Labour's existing rules on how to handle boundary changes are very much weighted in favour of helping sitting MPs. And with more than a dozen MPs now in their 70s, there are likely to be quite a few retirements. So it should be possible to accommodate most people somewhere. But if the left were to use its growing power in the party to change those rules and perhaps allow new entrants, then sitting MPs might have a lot more to worry about. Michael Crick, Channel 4 News, Hackney.
Well, with me now is Mark Harper, the Constitutional Reform Minister in the Coalition Government when this Boundary Commission was first established, and from her constituency in Hampstead, Tulip Siddiq, the Labour MP for West Hampstead and Kilburn, a seat which itself faces significant changes. Tulip Siddiq, let's start with you. It's quite hard to complain about the Boundary Commission, isn't it, because it's independent?
Look, I'm all in favour of making politics less expensive and creating equal constituencies. But what I'm not in favour is doing that at the expense of representation. And you've heard what Jeremy Corbyn just said. The list that the Conservatives are using, or if you say the independent people are using to create these proposals, are from last year. There's 2 million people in the country who are not accounted for in these proposals.
Let me put that. Let me put that direct to Mark Harper. The list you're using isn't up to date. It's not fair.
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that the current boundaries are from data that was from the year 2000, and if the proposals don't go through, or revised proposals don't go through, the next election will be fought on boundaries that were set on electoral registers from 20 years previous, which is clearly way out of date. Now, Tulip's point about the new people that registered for the referendum isn't a good one, because the 2 million extra voters were broadly spread across the country. 3/4 of seats increased in size by broadly the same percentages, so it wouldn't make a significant difference to the spread of seats across the country.
But why not avoid any controversy and use population rather than registered voters?
Well, it's much more relevant to use registered voters, because it's about how many people are eligible to vote in British elections. For example, if you use population, you'd be counting foreign nationals and people who aren't able to vote for MPs, and it wouldn't give you a proper sense of representation. We've always used registered voters in the past. That's the way the system's always worked.
Tulip Siddiq, isn't the real truth here that you're worried about your future, and particularly your own future, given that one Labour NEC member, the ruling committee member, said today that this would be an opportunity to select more loyal MPs who are loyal to Jeremy Corbyn?
Look, I'm standing in this seat, which was the Conservatives' #1 target seat last time. I'm not a stranger to challenges. I'm not scared of challenges. My problem is that we will be neglecting people, mostly young people, who are the 2 million people left off the list that they're calculating for these proposals. And I also want to call this naked gerrymandering. Let's call a spade a spade. Look at David Cameron. Just a few weeks ago, he put half of his Christmas card list in the unelected House of Lords. That cost £30 million alone. We're talking about the cost of politics. We can save money elsewhere, but let's not do it at the expense of representation.
OK, the Lords is a good point, isn't it? I mean, now the size of the Lords, 790 peers, I think, overwhelms the Commons and will do even more so when these changes go through.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, the Commons always gets its way because it's the elected House. But the second thing is, I'm not going to take any lectures from the Labour Party about the House of Lords. When I was a minister in the coalition government, as you pointed out, we brought forward proposals to reform the House of Lords, to make it democratic. The Labour Party refused to support the programme motion that would have been necessary to get that legislation through Parliament.
Well, let me put that
so
to
I'm not going to take any lectures from them about the House of Lords.
No lectures from you on the Lords, Tulip?
Well, I'm going to say that I think he should probably speak to his former Prime Minister, who spent £30 million alone putting members of his friends in the House of Lords. But also, look at the number of politically appointed special advisors. Since 2010, from the Conservative government, the cost is now £45 million. Look at High Speed Rail 2, £80 billion. Why don't we save money elsewhere? I really feel we cannot make constituencies equal, as they call it, and lose out on these 2 million people. In London alone, and I'm an MP in London.
But how much longer are you going to carry on being an MP in London?
More London MPs.
OK, but given what the NEC member, one of the NEC members said today, are you worried about being purged in favour of more loyal Corbynites?
The only thing I'm worried about at the moment is that the people in the most deprived areas of my constituency, like Kilburn, will not have fair representation. That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the 2 million people who are not on the list that the Conservatives are using. I'm not worried about purges, NEC or anything like that. I want to make sure I represent my constituents properly, and this naked gerrymandering has to stop.
OK. Mark Harper, just briefly, I mean, is this actually going to get through? Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Are MPs going to put this through?
No, I think it will get through. And I mean, I reject that point about gerrymandering. The boundary commissions are independent. The Boundary Commission for England is chaired by a High Court judge. They're neutral people drawing up according to the rules set by Parliament. So it's fair and reasonable. And I think these proposals will go through and we'll have votes then of equal weight across the country, which is in the interest of voters.
Mark Harper, Tulip Siddiq, thank you very much for joining me.
I've been getting away with it all.